All right, I think we are live. Welcome everyone, and for another to another episode of Coker's Chronicles. Today, my guest is John Tamny. He's the editor of RealClearMarkets, amongst a number of other things. Vice president at FreedomWorks, senior economic advisor to Toreador Research and Trading, and he's written several books. One recently that was entitled "They're Both Wrong: A Policy Guide for America's Frustrated Independent Thinkers." So I already like him already. I haven't even talked to him yet. So thanks for joining me, John.
Thanks for having me, Shay. Appreciate it.
So you recently wrote an article that was goes against popular opinion, and it's entitled "Rumors of the Death of Office Buildings Are Greatly Exaggerated." Could you explain what made you write that?
Well, what made me write is I've heard this story before. First of all, I remember back in the 1990s, because of voicemail and things like that, primitive stuff nowadays, the view was people can increasingly work from home. You can catch them anywhere. They don't need an assistant next to them. They've got this. And I witnessed my friends, many of them who got into commercial real estate, out-earned me by many multiples over the coming decades as skylines around the U.S. grew and skylines around the world grew. And they were up against some of the same commentary back then that, just the need for an office space isn't as evident. So I'd witnessed it for one thing. I'd seen it around the world that skylines only grow, but it also just was logical to me. Businesses put so much effort into building cultures, into having a cohesive unit, people working together. Steve Jobs' last thing that he did at Apple before he died really was putting together the headquarters there, and he built it with people bumping into each other very much in mind. He felt that was so healthy, that great minds bumping into each other and talking about things led to innovation. So the idea that this was going to stop, that suddenly workers were going to be isolated by businesses, ignores why companies are great in the first place.
Right. And so moving into that, you did some research, or it sounds like you've had quite a bit of experience with interviewing or writing about great companies. You've talked about some of the bigger, how much time companies spend on the location of their offices, the type of people they want to attract, et cetera. Today we have a totally different environment where everybody's working from home. Is this sustainable? Is it what's going to happen next?
No, it's not sustainable, and it's not because businesses weren't spending so much money on location and on office space just because they were vain or because they wanted to. They were doing this because there's great value to be had from talented people working alongside each other. The division of labor historically is established. When people are specializing as they produce things, they're producing a lot more, working alongside one another. Well, the division of thought is the same thing. And so the idea that it was going to suddenly make sense for people to be separated just defied basic common sense. Businesses have always had headquarters because it's valuable to have people working together. Isn't it interesting? And you would know this well. It's not just headquarters. What do new businesses do? They tend to cluster. The internet, they've been talking about the death of distance forever with the internet, but it's the case to this day that even though taxes are very high in California, even though regulations are high, there's great value if you're a technology company, for instance, to be headquartered near other technology companies. There's osmosis, there's learning, there's people cross-pollinating that you cannot get if everyone's working from home.
Yeah, those are good points. And so So you're not of the ilk that think that because we have these amazing technologies these days that we can all just hide in our bunkers and do Zoom meetings all day and continue the great progress of American companies.
No, of course not. That's what I think will happen is that because of Zoom, the need for headquarters will be even greater, and the need for people being around each other it'll actually stimulate more face-to-face human contact. You can't plan random meetups. You can't plan bumping into one another at the proverbial water cooler. These are things that just happen that lead to ideas. You can't create a culture over Zoom. You look at Goldman Sachs, it's the most prominent investment bank in the world, and it is precisely because they've been developing a culture for decades and realistically centuries. The idea that they could do that if everyone was working from home just rejects why they became great in the first place. It's a known quantity. I worked at Goldman, so I know this intimately. New associates there are given credit cards, and they're said, take out senior people for dinner, take out junior people, learn what it is that we're all about while you're in training. You can't do that from a distance. So the idea that suddenly some technology that allows us to talk to each other is going to transform how businesses work. No. It's just going to create even greater need for businesses to have headquarters.
Oh, wow. I've talked to a few clients recently that are in the banking sector, the legal sector. The people that are responsible for deciding how much office space to have over the next several years, whether their lease is expiring soon or not, the last several months have been a very difficult time to estimate the number of employees they're going to have in a couple of years and the amount of space, especially that they're going to have. Some smaller firms don't even know if they're going to be able to make it until then. What would you say? Is this a short-term kind of trend, do you think, or do you think it's here to stay that people will need less office space?
No, I think it's a short-term trend. Again, the value of a corporate headquarters is endless. And of course, there's uncertainty right now. We're seeing businesses of all stripes being suffocated by lockdowns that are utterly unnecessary. Is it any wonder that there's uncertainty? Some states open back up only for them to slow down the opening up, only to reverse course in the case, just as an example of Las Vegas. So naturally, there's uncertainty. But what is certain is that great businesses become that way because they put enormous funds and time into building cultures. Goldman Sachs was never about people being in the office all the time. Notable about, if you go to any of the major hubs for Goldman, no one, for the most part, has offices. And the idea there is simple. Get out on the road and meet with people. Figure out, if you don't have enough clients, go out and find new ones. And so it's not as though Goldman expects people to be in the office all the time. I think it's easy to say that many businesses will say that we're still going to have a headquarters, but we will huddle here less often. We want you out, but that's always been true. But the value of being together, the value of seeing how other people work, of senior people explaining to junior people how to do things, how to meet the needs of customers, cannot be done separately, and that's never going to change.
Right. Just resetting for those of you who have just joined us, I'm talking to John Tamny. If you have questions, please feel free to write them into the comments section of either YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're watching this live feed. John, I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about China. You've written a lot about China. And I haven't even had time to read all the articles that I recently found from you. But China's in the news today quite a bit. There's a big movement here in the U.S. that says that perhaps we should get rid of all of our existing supply chains and magically make everything here in the U.S. and just with a snap of the finger that can happen. It's much more complicated than that, as you know. But how should we think about China these days?
China's existence is instrumental in the growth, the continued growth of the U.S. economy. If China had remained communist, there's this view that China is a communist country. No, anyone who grew up in the 20th century knows that communism is defined by unrelenting drudgery of empty store shelves. China is the exact opposite. It pushed that aside because it was a murderous ideology that killed tens of millions of Chinese in the 20th century. China is a capitalist country that is at present conducting a love affair with everything American. To get off an airplane in China is to feel as an American to be the most welcome person in the whole country, because everywhere you look is a McDonald's, a Pizza Hut, a Burger King, a Kentucky Fried Chicken, a Nike store, an Apple store, a Microsoft store, Abercrombie and Fitch, Sunglass Hut. There are 4,200 Starbucks in China. GM sells more cars in China than it does in North America. Everything American, the Chinese people are falling in love with. And so the idea that we'd want to cut ourselves off from that, which from an economy that is a huge source of business for the greatest American businesses in the world, is just laughable, and it's disturbing. It's also problematic because one reason so many U.S. businesses are so valuable is because of sales in China. To go after China would be to go after the U.S. economy.
Yeah. We have a question regarding real estate that says, are there, oh, here, I'll just put it on the screen. Are there metropolitan areas that are stronger or weaker right now in terms of offices?
It's a good question. It's probably one that Shay Coker would know much better than John Tamny knows. It's always hard to say. Isn't it interesting? If you look back to the beginning of the 21st century, remember at the time the internet was about to have a major bust, and major capital outflows took place from California and Seattle. Amazon stock had been in the hundreds and it fell all the way to, I think, $7 a share. I think actually lower than that. And so the technology locales weren't doing very well. On the other hand, the dollar was in free fall during that time. And so commodities like oil, kind of yesterday's economy, tend to do very well. And so, back then, there would have been very little call to invest in commercial real estate in Seattle, probably very little call to invest in commercial real estate in Northern California. How things have changed. And so where things are going now, you look at Seattle in the 1970s, everyone was exiting. Now to visit Seattle, everywhere you look, someone's from somewhere else. Pittsburgh nowadays, mostly you meet people from Pittsburgh. I would submit to you that soon enough we're going to hear about a lot of people moving to Pittsburgh. It seems to finally be catching back on. To visit there, you see that a lot of people are staying in Pittsburgh. There's a big technology boom going on there, and so that could change things. And so it's hard to say what's bad and what's good. It changes so quickly.
Yeah, well, just from a superficial kind of point of view, I think that to respond to his question, it would, there's markets like Austin that are growing, that have rumors of the new Tesla plant located nearby. We have places with lots of sun and no state income tax like Texas and Florida. So we have a lot of people in South Florida from New York and New Jersey right now, especially, but we've always had quite a bit, but they are coming in droves over the past few months.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of that. So Austin has become very much a tech location in modern times, but it's fascinating to consider amid this. Half of the world's venture capital still flows to California. And some would say, well, wait a second, high taxes, high regulation. No doubt it's true. I don't support any of that. But you cannot recreate the cluster of talent that is still in California, that is a big driver, that is a big magnet for talent or for human capital around the world that comes there. But there's also something that people don't talk about very much. If you were to leave, to say, a Dell or a Goldman Sachs in Texas to start up a business right now, they would have a much greater ability to limit your ability to grow and get started. In California, on the other hand, it's got all these other things that we wouldn't necessarily like, but they don't enforce non-competes there. And so to leave a Goldman Sachs or leave a Google on a Friday, you can be in business that following Monday without a problem. So the ability for human capital to move around in California has been a huge source of its ongoing growth. And so my sense is if the economy reverts to freedom, you're going to see skylines build up in all sorts of places that you wouldn't expect, but also you're going to see places like California continue to grow in that regard.
Going back to China a little bit, we're talking of in the U.S. the Federal Reserve has printed crazy amounts of money lately. China has always been accused of printing money themselves and devaluing their currency. Can the U.S. ever say anything about Chinese manipulating their currency again after what we've seen over the past several months?
Well, a couple of things. The U.S. was never in a position to accuse the Chinese of manipulating their currency simply because they never manipulated it. Since 1994, the yuan has been pegged to the dollar. If the dollar is strong or rising, you can pick your objective measure that it's rising against. So is the yuan rising. If the dollar is weakening, so is the yuan weakening. China is doing with its currency what dozens and dozens of countries do explicitly around the world, peg their currency to the dollar, but that realistically every currency in the world does peg their currency to the dollar. Why is that? Because the dollar factors in just about every trade anywhere in the world. And so you want to have a fairly consistent relationship with the currency. The Fed doesn't print money. I think that's a misnomer. And if it could, it wouldn't mean anything. Money serves no purpose other than as a facilitator of exchange. I've got bread. I want your wine. You want the butcher's meat. Money is an agreement about value that allows us to trade with one another. And so printing money wouldn't mean anything. And all we have to do to understand that is, okay, let's imagine if the Fed dropped $6 billion down in East St. Louis. Would it suddenly be prosperous there? No, the money would depart quickly because there's nothing to trade there. There's lots of money supply in Beverly Hills. There's lots of money supply in Coral Gables. There's very little in Opelika. You know, it's just money. Money is a consequence of production. It doesn't drive it. And so lots of economists believe that central banks can print on the way to prosperity. They can do no such thing. Money always comes after. But in terms of what the Chinese are doing, they're doing the right thing. You want to have consistent currency relationships. Money is just a measure. The shame is that the U.S. in modern times hasn't maintained a stable currency because in its unwillingness to maintain a stable dollar that holds its value throughout time, it's created enormous amounts of chaos around the world. Needless that the number that comes up is there's roughly 5 trillion worth of currency trading taking place every single day of the year. What a shame. Back when currencies were stable, there was no need to do this. So we've lost a lot of great minds to the facilitation, to the trading of the chaos rather than creating new things.
Yeah. Aaron Gunkelman is asking, what does the speaker think is the best for what is to come? Now, Aaron, you might have to clarify that question a little bit because I don't understand it, but maybe John does.
Well, I'll start answering ahead of any clarification. I'm very optimistic. Let's be clear, what happened in terms of the lockdowns was a tragedy. I will add that the more the models that predicted millions and millions of Americans' death, the more that it existed, the more I would have been against the lockdowns. For one, if the expectation is that millions were going to die from a virus, why on earth would you need to force people to shelter in place to begin with? The lockdowns would be superfluous. But what can't be forgotten is that economic growth is the source of our increasingly good health. In the 19th century, if you broke your hip, you were going to die. If you broke your leg, 1 in 3 chances of death. The operation for it was amputation. Back then, the biggest killers were things like pneumonia and tuberculosis. Pneumonia was the captain of man's death. Why isn't it the captain today? It isn't because great wealth was created on the way to massive increases in funding for scientists figuring out ways to elongate our lives. Cancer used to be a distant eighth in the diseases that killed Americans. This was in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was simply because people didn't live long enough to get to that point. And so the idea that you would ever shut down an economy to fight a virus just beggars belief. And so what a disaster. There was never an argument for it. And then I'll just throw in, China is a perfect example that the virus was never terribly lethal. How we know that is that the best US companies have enormous sales exposure to China. If it had been killing millions of people, as a consequence, in January and February, U.S. shares would have been plummeting to reflect the fact that it's the most important market for U.S. companies outside of the U.S. was dying en masse. And so we knew then that it wasn't a lethal disease. It wasn't lethal. Whatever you think about the virus, it doesn't take a medical doctor to look at market signals. Markets shine a light on what other people choose not to shine a light on. It was very clear then that this was not a lethal virus, whatever else you think of it. And so the lockdowns never made sense. What's important is that politicians have been doing this forever. This is what they do. They break things and then throw money at this. At least in this one, they didn't get us into some idiotic war that killed off a generation or hundreds, thousands of our best and brightest. And so I'm optimistic that the recovery from this will be very quick, simply because in this case, our young generation wasn't killed off by their idiotic decisions. In this case, they were just unemployed. Well, economies naturally grow. Once they end these idiotic lockdowns that are serving no purpose, you will see a big rebound in economic growth.
John, you're preaching to the choir on that one. I totally agree. We have a question from Joanna Silva, who says, do you expect an increase in the vacancy rate due to social distancing, or do you see companies taking more space to keep employees further apart?
It's a great question. And again, I think it's something that the people watching probably know better than I. I am making an argument that corporate culture is essential to corporate vitality and growth and valuation. So to me, the idea that suddenly corporations would shed office space and send people home to work just defies common sense. It defies the history of how companies have evolved. Now, it's interesting to think, yeah, maybe this will reveal itself in terms of greater office space, companies buying more to provide for employees who might be nervous a little more space to do things. That's entirely possible. Again, my expectation is that skylines will grow, that office space will grow because there will be need for it. What is a certainty for me is that the need for corporate and office space will not end based on this. If you want to be a successful corporation, you generally must have a successful culture of talented people sharing ideas. You can't do that from a distance. My favorite story in the column I wrote is Michael Milken. He was running this great talent agency in Hollywood, and he wanted to know where everyone was every day, and not because he didn't trust them. His employees were essential to him. He wanted them in headquarters because they had to be working together to figure out how to serve Hollywood's best and brightest in the entertainment industry. This wasn't hatred, and he paid his employees the best. And if you're not in the office, I need to know where you are. Are you okay? Are you ill? because we need to, so that we can pay you the best, we need to be making sure that our clients in the entertainment industry are being paid the best. We need you here. You can't do that from a distance. Zoom cannot replace the genius of people working together.
Yeah, that's a great point. Patrick Samuel, all the way from Brazil. Good to hear from you, Patrick. He has a couple of questions. On the industrial side, do you see industries moving manufacturing plants closer to the regions they'll supply in the near future?
It's a great question. My guess is no. What kills manufacturing jobs? Economic progress does. It used to be that manufacturing was a good job in the United States, but you look at the cities, Detroit and Flint, that clung to manufacturing jobs, they're failed cities now. If the loss of manufacturing jobs were a killer of a city or state, then New York City and Los Angeles would be the most depressed cities in all of the world, because in the 1920s and 30s, New York was the #1 manufacturing city in the U.S. Detroit was 2, Flint was 3, Los Angeles was 4. The most prosperous U.S. cities with the best skylines are that way precisely because they moved that work elsewhere. Nothing wrong with that. The Chinese are presently trying, their people, just like American workers, they increasingly don't want to work in factories. The opportunity, because of economic growth, because China is increasingly a free economy, continues to grow. And so manufacturing jobs aren't very desirable. And furthermore, they don't pay very well. And so where they're going, it's hard to, they're probably going to go to the poorer countries. That signals progress. It signals opportunity. It used to be in Vietnam where Nike, when they originally opened up factories there, the people walked to work. Then they had enough money to ride bikes to work. Then it was scooters. Now they drive cars to the factories. Eventually, those factories will leave Vietnam and go elsewhere. What's entirely possible is that you'll see some factories move back, but not because they're job creators, but because you can increasingly automate so much of this. And so there's an argument that we're going to see some of that happening. But the day the U.S. becomes a manufacturing economy again is the day that you know to pull your money out of it, because it's a sign that it's going backwards. Those are the jobs of the past. The U.S. is the future. It's my expectation that in the coming decades, those of you on this call who have little kids, your kids will do jobs in what we call the entertainment economy. More and more people will do work that they can't get enough of, that allows them to do what they did growing up, but for a living. We're going to have 4-day work weeks, 3-day work weeks, where people earn enormous sums of money. And so a lot of work is going to be people doing what they love, entertaining people who have exponentially more free time. My prediction is it will be called the entertainment economy. To me, fascinating about it is as this grows, you'll see politicians, idiotic politicians who now promise to bring back manufacturing jobs. They'll say, we're going to bring back those service jobs. This never changes. Politicians always promise to bring back the past. Thankfully, markets don't abide them.
That's a very cool perspective. I enjoyed hearing that. That looks like all the questions have been answered so far.
Wait, what?
Yeah, you're amazingly efficient. But do you as far as you mentioned a couple of trends, what else do you see happening, at least here in the U.S.? Do you see further integration with other countries, or do you see less integration with other countries?
Oh, I see further integration just because it makes so much sense. You know, isn't it interesting? You see politicians saying about China what they said about Japan in the 1980s. Oh, they're stealing all our jobs. They're going to take away. No. Japan's rise greatly enriched the U.S. It was a much bigger threat to the U.S. when it was a poor country. Same with China today. Precisely because the Chinese are feverishly producing for us, the odds of them wanting to invade us are exponentially lower. And so the integration is going to happen more and more, thank goodness. And let's remember, you don't see businesses complaining about this. And you don't, because for a business to knock China would be the equivalent of Gucci saying to Beverly Hills, we hate you. It'd be the equivalent of name your fancy brand telling Manhattan, you're over with, everyone there is stupid, and we're not going to sell there anymore. China hasn't scratched the surface of its potential. Let's not forget that while the skylines there are amazing, I wish people could see Shanghai. It's unbelievable. But there are skylines increasingly like that, even in the poor cities there. But the point of all this is that the people that haven't scratched the surface of their ability. And so businesses in the US continue to want to not just be integrated there, but they want to expand there. And they do, because the opportunities are endless. Again, there's 4,200 Starbucks there on the way to 7,000. It's the second largest market for Starbucks. It's the second largest market for Nike. It's the second largest box office for US movie companies. And so the idea that they would want to have a cessation of what has been so brilliant for the growth of US companies is just, it defies common sense. People were terrified by the stock market corrections that were, as they always are, a creation of political error a few months ago. Try ending any integration with China. Try forcing US production out of China and watch what stock markets do. It will make March look like child's play. It would be a disaster. China is Americans need to embrace what's brilliant for them. Every day the Chinese get up and go to work, Americans get a raise, their paychecks consume more. Get over this idea that there should be one global power. That's never been the case. It will never be the case. It's a shame that there are wars. It's a shame that we think in terms of that, but get over the fact the Chinese are going to grow, and it's going to be brilliant for the US. Be excited about the fact that there's probably 20 or 30 Steve Jobs equivalents right now working in China to figure out a way to vastly enhance our standards, living standards. The future is going to be amazing. And one reason it's going to be is because of countries like China shedding their communist past and embracing the profit motive.
That's awesome. Just on a little side tangent, what do you think about the recent happenings in Hong Kong, in light of the kind of the I guess the crackdown of the Chinese?
I think it's a great question. I think they're very sad, very, very sad, simply because Hong Kong means so much more to the world in a sense than it does just to China. Hong Kong is a living, breathing symbol of what happens when people are wholly free. People talk about duty-free shops. Hong Kong's a duty-free island. Other than tobacco and cars, everything is duty-free. There's no taxes on anything. It's historically been the freest place on earth. No natural resources. The natural resources, the people who show up there and prosper. What an amazing story of what happens when people are free to live and do as they want. And so you want this symbol to exist forever. And I hope the Chinese government realizes this, that it's more than just two countries or one country, two systems. It's a symbol for the world. It's interesting that if you look at capital flows, my understanding is that capital is largely staying in Hong Kong. There hasn't been a big outflow of people or money. I think we tend to, how do I put this, in rich countries like the US, we tend to focus on things that in other parts of the world people don't have time to focus on. This is not to minimize it. I hope the Chinese government doesn't blow it. I hope Beijing doesn't blow it. But what interests us in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Miami is something that probably if you walked up to the typical person in mainland China, they'd say, oh, we don't even know what you're talking about. As in, we're too focused on our business. We're too focused on our job. My sense from visiting there is that for the typical person in Hong Kong, they see a pretty optimistic future, that they'll still be free to be innovative and creative. My sense is that's true in China too. Certainly to visit Shanghai and the other cities is to believe that. I think we focus on people protesting, and maybe protesting for a good reason, but I think what we miss is that there's no real intent to crack down in ways that these people aren't able to be creative in the way that they were before. I hope I'm right. I recognize that I could be wrong, but it strikes me that if there were a major crackdown going on right now, that you'd see a massive outflow of capital from Hong Kong. We haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, it's a good point. I talked to some friends in Hong Kong recently, and they mentioned they had similar sentiments there. We have one more question from Aaron. He's asking where do you believe the majority of institutional private equity dry powder will be deployed over the next year?
Well, if I knew, I'd be a billionaire. No, but my guess is that, and we're already seeing this right now. Markets never price in the present; they always price in the future, and that tells us two things. For one, it's a reminder that market signals, investors knew in January and February that this was not a terribly lethal virus. That's not a medical statement, but if it had been a big killer, it would have killed millions of people in China, and the government people say, well, the government lies about the numbers. Markets would have exposed the lie, as in there would have been a big sell-off in U.S. shares to reflect the fact that this virus was running roughshod through a country and killing a major market for U.S. companies. And so anticipate things. And so they've been rallying a lot lately to tie it to the Fed is just to misunderstand basic economics. The idea that the Fed could trick stock markets is just, it's not fit for serious conversation. What we have seen happen is that there's an expectation of an end to the lockdowns. And with that, optimism about the future. So I think a lot of the dry powder will be deployed in the United States. There's this myth that economic growth is driven by consumption. No. Consumption is what we all do. That's just a given. Investment, savings drive economic growth because it provides capital to innovators, people who want to bring the future into the present. And so without excusing what happened for a second, one of the things that did happen is that a lot of savings were built up. And so there's going to be an enormous amount of savings deployed, I think, in the United States. The U.S. is the ultimate place to park capital. And so we're going to see, because there is in fact less consumption in some ways amid this, there will be a big amount of capital flowing into new ideas in the United States and in other free parts around the world. Let's never forget that the U.S. is basically a 50-state Hong Kong. You know, it's largely free. We make all sorts of mistakes, but largely a free country. And so I have every belief that capital flows into the U.S. will continue, and so will they into China. Politicians will talk about China evil. England's mad at China. Australia's mad at China. Look at what businesses do. Businesses are not buying this. They continue want to be in the places where opportunity is greatest. China and the U.S. represent arguably the best opportunity for the future.
Yeah, that's true. Well, John, thanks so much for joining me today, and for all of you who have not seen RealClearMarkets, I encourage you to go check it out. Is there any other departing words that you have, or places that people can contact or find you?
You can find me on Twitter. You can find me at RealClearMarkets, of course. Historically, I've had a column at Forbes, which I just got off track, but I'll resume that. Freedomworks.org is where I spend most of my days when the lockdowns aren't happening. So you can find me lots of places. My books are on Amazon. All of you watching today should buy several copies of each. I think that'd be the right thing to do. But no, please keep in touch. And my parting words would be optimistic. People have been predicting the end of the United States since before it was the end of the United States. Yet if you bet against it, you've always been wrong. And I in the same way, if you bet against global progress, you've generally always been wrong. And so it's my expectation that skylines will continue to grow, and they will because they make sense, because businesses do best when the people are working alongside one another. And so don't fall for the pessimism now. It's a loser's bet.
That's a great message. Well, really appreciate it, John. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me, Shay. I appreciate it.